The first time I saw him, I never imagined he would become everything to me. It was a rain-soaked night. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, trying to clear the fog from my mind. The city lights blurred into smeared smudges through the windshield, but none of it mattered. Nothing mattered. I was trying to leave behind everything I thought I knew about myself, every expectation, every assumption about the life I should be living. I was driving away from a life that didn't fit, a life where I was supposed to be someone I wasn't. But that night, I wasn't prepared for the one thing that would shatter my world. The sudden screech of tires, followed by the sickening thud of metal against metal, jolted me back into reality. A crash. A violent, unforgiving crash right in front of me. I could feel the thudding of my heart as I slammed the car into park and rushed out. The rain soaked me instantly, but I didn't care. All that mattered was the stranger lying motionless on the street. His face was barely visible under the hood of his soaked jacket, his body twisted unnaturally. Without a second thought, I crouched next to him, checking for a pulse, my hands trembling. In that moment, my whole life stopped. The world around me was nothing but the rain and the stranger who seemed to be holding on to a life I hadn't yet realized I would risk everything for. But when he opened his eyes and looked up at me, the moment felt like it lasted forever. The sharp, brilliant gaze, filled with confusion, pain, but something else, a flicker of recognition that neither of us could explain. He didn't say a word, and I didn't either. I just held his hand as tightly as I could, even though I had no idea who he was or why he was suddenly in my world. The paramedics arrived too late, taking him to the hospital before I even had a chance to ask his name. As the flashing lights of the ambulance faded into the distance, I found myself standing in the rain, shivering, not from the cold but from the heavy, undeniable pull inside me. What had just happened? I barely knew this man, but something told me that our story was just beginning. Something told me that everything I had ever feared about myself, everything I had been running from, was going to change because of him. That night, I drove home with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. This stranger wasn't going to be just another fleeting memory. He was the beginning of something terrifying, something wonderful, something I hadn't yet figured out how to handle. Days turned into weeks, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was waiting for something, or more precisely, someone. The encounter with him had become a haunting echo in the back of my mind, reverberating through every quiet moment. I'd spent hours at the hospital, but they wouldn't tell me anything about him. Legal barriers, privacy, the same excuses they gave to every concerned stranger who came looking for answers. I couldn't help but wonder if fate had played some cruel game with me. Was this just a freak accident, or was it something more? Then one evening, I found myself standing outside the coffee shop, the one I always visited when I needed to clear my head. I don't know why I even bothered showing up that day. Maybe it was the desire to pretend that life was still predictable, to find some kind of normalcy in the mundane. But as I pushed open the door, I saw him. He was sitting at a corner table, his back to the door, seemingly lost in a book. The sight of him took my breath away, not because of anything particularly spectacular about his appearance, but because of the overwhelming sense of recognition that flooded me. There he was, alive, healthy, but somehow more enigmatic than before. My heart raced, and a part of me wanted to turn around and leave. But something deeper inside urged me to walk forward. I approached cautiously, unsure of what to say or how to explain why I was even there. Before I could reach his table, he looked up, and for the first time, I saw the softness in his eyes, the vulnerability that had been hidden behind the stoic expression when I found him on the street. He didn't speak, but I could see the recognition in his gaze too. It was as if the universe had placed us in this moment for a reason, and neither of us could deny it. "You're the one from the accident," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unsure if words could carry the weight of the questions I had. "I don't know why, but I knew I'd see you again," he continued, his words more a confession than a statement. I wanted to ask him everything, about the accident, about his life, about why we felt this strange connection. But instead, all that came out was a simple, "I'm glad you're okay." And just like that, the world seemed to shift. That moment wasn't just coincidence. It was a crossroads that neither of us could ignore. The air between us was thick with unspoken tension, as if we both recognized the depth of what was happening, yet we were too afraid to acknowledge it. Neither of us was ready for the bombshell that was coming, but neither of us could walk away. We met again the next day and the day after that and every day after, as though we had no choice. Our meetings became inevitable, magnetized by something neither of us fully understood. At first it was small talk, casual exchanges about everything and nothing. I learned that his name was Leo. He had an easy smile and an even easier laugh, the kind that made you feel like you'd known him forever, even though you were just getting to know him. He spoke in fragments, as though he was trying to hold on to parts of himself that had been lost in the accident, and I found myself wanting to fill in those gaps for him. But there was a distance between us, an unspoken barrier neither of us could cross. We hadn't talked about the night of the crash, and I wasn't sure I was ready to hear what he might say. The truth was, I was scared. Scared of what this connection might mean, scared of what might happen if I allowed myself to fall into whatever this was. But on the third night, Leo broke the silence. We were sitting on the rooftop of a small, hidden bar, our legs dangling over the edge, the city lights twinkling beneath us. I was trying to laugh at some ridiculous story he was telling, but my heart was racing, and I could barely focus on his words. "I don't think I'm supposed to be here," he said suddenly, his voice low, almost to himself. "I mean, with you, I don't think I should be here at all, not after what happened." My stomach dropped. I could feel the weight of his words pressing against my chest. I had no idea what he was talking about. He wasn't talking about the accident, was he? No, it was something deeper, something that felt like a confession that would break everything wide open. My breath caught in my throat and I waited, my fingers curling around the edge of my glass. He turned to look at me, and for a split second, his eyes held something that resembled fear. "You don't know this, but I wasn't just a random guy on the street that night," he continued, his voice trembling. I was running from something, someone. And I think I wanted to die when I stepped into that street. But then I saw you, and for a moment I wanted to live." The words hit me like a punch. I had no idea how to respond. I wanted to say something comforting, but what could I say? It felt like everything I thought I knew about this connection had just crumbled before me. Leo wasn't just a stranger who had been in an accident. He had been a man at the brink of something far darker. But there was a flicker of light in his words too. The way he said he wanted to live. It made me question everything I'd been afraid of. Was he telling me this because he needed me to save him? Or was it the other way around? Did I need him in some way I couldn't yet understand? The night felt heavy as his confession settled between us, and for the first time, I realized I wasn't the only one running from something. We were both running, but in opposite directions, too scared to confront the truth of who we were, what we wanted, and what this unspoken connection could mean. The days after Leo's confession blurred together in a haze of confusion and longing. I couldn't shake the image of him sitting there on the rooftop, his face pale, his voice broken. The man who had nearly died in front of me had been running from something far darker than the accident. It wasn't just the physical collision with the car, it was a collision with himself, with his own demons. And yet, despite all the chaos and fear, there was a part of me that couldn't look away. Something inside me had shifted the moment he'd opened up, a sense of empathy that I hadn't known I was capable of. I'd never thought of myself as someone who could fix someone else's pain, yet with Leo, I found myself wanting to try. But what did he need from me? Could I give him the space to heal, or would I just drag him further into my own brokenness? We started seeing each other in ways that felt less like coincidence and more like inevitability. Late-night walks in the rain, coffee on quiet mornings, long silences shared in the dim light of his apartment. But no matter how close we grew, there was always this unspoken wall between us, a barrier neither of us could break through. It wasn't the kind of wall that could be seen. It was the kind that existed in the small glances we exchanged, in the way his hand would hesitate just before touching mine, in the way our conversations always seemed to skirt around the truth. He still didn't talk much about what he'd been running from, and I hadn't yet summoned the courage to ask. Maybe it was because I feared what would happen if we got too close, or maybe it was because I was terrified of what I might find in myself when we crossed that line. But then, everything changed again. It was one of those evenings where the world seemed too quiet, too perfect. A strange, fragile peace settled over us as we walked along the edge of the park. The streetlights flickered as if the universe was holding its breath. We stopped by the lake, the moonlight glimmering on the water's surface, and for the first time, Leo's eyes softened. He looked at me like he could see into the very core of who I was. "I think I've been lying to myself," he whispered, his voice barely audible against the night. "I thought I didn't deserve to be happy, that I didn't deserve to be loved. But when I'm with you, I don't feel like I'm broken anymore. I feel like I might actually be able to find my way back to myself." His words cut through the silence like a razor. I wanted to speak, to tell him how much I needed to hear that, but I was afraid of what it might mean. What if we didn't have the strength to heal together? What if loving him meant losing myself in the process? And then, just as quickly as it came, the moment shattered. The sudden ringing of his phone broke through the delicate silence between us. He glanced at the screen and his expression changed, just slightly, a flicker of recognition that was gone before I could process it. His shoulders tensed, his fingers gripped the phone, and for a split second I saw a flicker of panic in his eyes. "I have to go," he said, his voice tight, his hand pulling away from mine before I could react. I can't stay here." Before I could ask what was happening, he was already turning to leave, his steps quickening as if something was chasing him. Something in me snapped. I couldn't let him run this time. "Leo," I called out, my voice louder than I intended. But he didn't stop. He didn't turn around. And just like that, the person I had come to care for more than anything disappeared into the night, leaving me alone with the questions I was finally ready to ask, but too afraid to hear the answers to. I spent days trying to piece together what had just happened, but each attempt only left me feeling more lost. Leo had vanished, and in his absence, a quiet emptiness took root inside me. I replayed that moment by the lake over and over, trying to decipher the meaning behind his sudden departure, but nothing made sense. It was as if he had slipped through my fingers the moment I allowed myself to feel anything real. I had thought I was ready for whatever truth he had been hiding, but I wasn't. I couldn't be, because deep down I knew that whatever was keeping him from being fully present with me, whatever that phone call had meant, was a part of him that I couldn't reach. And in the end, it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about me too. I had spent so much time running from my own fears, from what this connection with Leo might mean, that I had forgotten to ask myself the one question I needed to. What do I really want? Then, just when I was about to resign myself to the quiet despair of not knowing, I got a message. It was brief and it came without warning. "I'm sorry. I wasn't strong enough, but I love you." The words were simple, but they hit me like a thunderclap. Leo's message was a confession, an admission of something I hadn't dared hope for. But what did it mean? What did it mean when he had been running away from love, when he had been scared to let anyone in, to let me in? What did it mean when the last time we were together, he couldn't even bear to look me in the eye as he walked away? I didn't know what to do with his words, or with the rising tide of emotion that overwhelmed me when I read them. I had to know more. I had to understand why, after everything, he was telling me this now. I didn't waste a second. I knew where to find him. The address was scribbled on a piece of paper he'd once given me when he'd invited me to meet him at his place. I stood outside the building, my heart hammering in my chest, trying to convince myself that this wasn't some mistake, some desperate plea for closure that I wasn't ready for. When the door opened and I saw Leo standing there, his eyes shadowed with uncertainty, I didn't know whether to run or stay. But before I could make up my mind, he stepped forward, taking my hand, just as he had the night of the accident. His grip was firm, steady, like a promise. "I wasn't ready for this, but I am now," he said quietly. "I love you and I'll be here, even if it means risking everything." In that moment, I understood. Love wasn't about perfect timing or the absence of fear. It was about taking a chance, no matter how messy, no matter how terrifying. And so, as I stood there with Leo, this stranger who had come into my life in the most unimaginable way, I realized that what we had, what we shared, was worth everything. Worth the risk, worth the pain, and ultimately, worth the love we had finally found in each other.